On the evening of 21st December 1930, in a ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, New York, an 18-year-old Barbara Woolworth Hutton lifts her long white gloves a fraction higher, smoothing them against her bare arms as the orchestra begins another foxtrot. The chandeliers burn steadily over tables heaped with flowers. Outside, the Great Depression has already shuttered shops and bread lines snake through the streets. A society columnist will describe the debut as the most lavish ball of the season, noting the presence of Astors, Rockefellers, and two imported stars, Rudy Vallee and Maurice Chevalier, hired to serenade the heiress whose party reportedly cost 4 times the norm. In one photograph from that night preserved in press archives, Barbara's gloved hand clutches her dance card a little too tightly. The caption calls her the poor little rich girl for the first time. The face in the flashbulb's glare suggests that the phrase will prove less headline than sentence. The gloves are immaculate. They will not stay that way. In May 1917, a 4-year-old Barbara Woolworth Hutton waits in a suite at the Plaza Hotel, New York, while adults rush in hushed tones along the corridor outside. Her mother, Edna Woolworth Hutton, has been found dead in an adjoining room. The New York Times will record the cause as suffocation from mastoiditis, an infection of the bone behind the ear that can close airways, while rumors of deliberate suicide spread through society's whispered exchanges, despite no evidence to support them. Later biographers examining this formative loss note that the sudden death, unexplained to the child, shrouded in adult evasions and conflicting stories, casts a shadow over Barbara's capacity for trust and attachment for the rest of her life. In family recollections preserved by relatives and later chroniclers, she's remembered sitting very still in a high-backed chair as a governess pulls tiny black kid gloves onto her small hands before the funeral, practicing the correct way to fold them in her lap, the proper angle to hold them when standing, the exact gesture for acknowledging condolences without speaking. The sensory details of that plaza suite remain. The rustle of heavy curtains being drawn against spring sunlight, the smell of cut lilies sent by families whose names she doesn't know, the cool leather of those miniature gloves against her palms. The child who will one day own palaces scattered across 3 continents is, at this precise moment, a 4-year-old being dressed for a public tragedy she cannot comprehend, learning her first lesson in the performance that will define her existence. The funeral itself, held at the Campbell Funeral Home on Broadway, draws hundreds of mourners from New York society and from the national community of Woolworth store managers and executives whose livelihoods depend on the empire Frank Woolworth built. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe elaborate floral arrangements filling multiple rooms, representatives from dozens of charitable organizations her mother had supported, and the small figure of Barbara in her black dress and tiny gloves standing beside her father, who maintains the stoic composure expected of men in his position. She does not cry during the service, whether from shock, from careful coaching beforehand, or from some instinctive understanding that tears would constitute a breach of the performance expected of her. Observers cannot determine. The narrator observes that the gloves meant to hide her grief, to cover her small, vulnerable hands and signal proper mourning, also begin her education in concealment more broadly. How to hide confusion behind stillness, fear behind good posture, the bewildering absence of maternal love behind perfect deportment. What is presented as protection functions equally as training in emotional containment, the first layer of a costume she will spend her life adjusting, never quite able to remove it, even in private moments when its weight becomes unbearable. By November 1918, barely 18 months after her mother's death, Barbara was living primarily in the vast townhouse at 4 East 80th Street, one of 3 adjoining mansions that her grandfather, Frank Winfield Woolworth, built for family members just off Fifth Avenue. The houses, connected internally but maintaining separate entrances, were designed to keep the Woolworth clan close while preserving the boundaries that great wealth requires. Her father, Franklin Laws Hutton, co-founder of the investment firm E.F. Hutton and Company, is frequently absent, absorbed in the business of managing other people's fortunes while leaving his daughter's upbringing to governesses, tutors, and household staff whose salaries he pays but whose daily presence he rarely shares. The staff at the 80th Street house consists of more than 20 people: a head butler, under butlers, footmen, ladies' maids, a French chef, kitchen maids, scullery workers, laundresses, a chauffeur, and the succession of governesses and tutors responsible for Barbara's daily care and education. Contemporary household management records from similar establishments suggest the rigid hierarchy among servants, the elaborate daily routines required to maintain a house of such scale, the constant presence of staff members moving through hallways and service corridors that parallel but never intersect with the family's principal rooms except when service is required. For a child growing up in such an environment, the experience is paradoxical, constantly surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. The servants are present but maintain careful distance, their attention focused on tasks rather than on providing the spontaneous affection and engagement that children require. They speak when spoken to, appear and disappear according to schedules determined by bells and established routines, and understand that their employment depends on maintaining proper boundaries. 2. Young Barbara, they must seem almost like animated furniture, functional, necessary, but not quite fully human in the way that parents and peers would be. In 1924, when Barbara is 11, her grandmother Jenny Crichton Woolworth dies, leaving Barbara over $26 million in trust, a sum that trust documents and brokerage records show growing through careful investment to more than $40 million by the time she reaches her 21st birthday, equivalent to hundreds of millions in contemporary purchasing power. In these legal documents, in the quarterly statements and dividend reports that accumulate in lawyers' offices, Barbara exists not as a grieving child, but as figures on a balance sheet: units of stock in the Woolworth Company and other holdings, dividend payments, carefully structured trust funds designed to shield capital from taxation and ensure its orderly transfer across generations. Family letters from this period, recalled decades later by her cousin Dina Merrill in published interviews, describe a shy child who rarely played with other children her age, who moved through rooms filled with old master paintings and heavy European furniture, who sat at formal dinners where conversation flowed around her while she remained silent unless directly addressed, at the door before each outing to Central Park with a governess, to children's parties at other Fifth Avenue mansions, to afternoon teas at the homes of her grandmother's friends. A servant adjusts Barbara's gloves, checking that no bare skin shows at the wrist, that the buttons are properly fastened, that her appearance meets the standards expected of a Woolworth heiress. The ritual of glove adjustment becomes so automatic that Barbara learns to stand with her arms slightly extended, wrists turned outward, while adult hands, usually a governess's or lady's maid's, tug the leather smooth, fasten the tiny pearl buttons, and verify that the fit is perfect. She learns to remain absolutely still during these adjustments, to breathe shallowly so her arms don't move, to treat her own body as an object being prepared for display rather than as the location of her actual self. The narrator reflects that the fortune securing her material future also ensures a particular kind of isolation. Almost everyone around her is paid to be there, their affection and attention calibrated to her family's wealth rather than to her individual self. When money replaces maternal love and paternal presence, when paid staff outnumber family members in the daily rhythms of childhood, the stage is set for a life in which titles and jewels and expensive gifts will become the only currencies she fully trusts, the only languages she believes others speak sincerely. By the late 1920s, as Barbara enters adolescence, her education becomes more formalized and deliberate. She attends Miss Hewitt's classes on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a small, exclusive day school favored by the daughters of New York's oldest families, then transfers to Miss Porter's school in Farmington, Connecticut, the boarding institution where generations of American heiresses have been prepared for their social debuts and advantageous marriages. School records and yearbook photographs preserved in Miss Porter's archives show a neat, unsmiling girl in the day uniform of proper gloves, cloche hat, and carefully pressed dress, a figure who appears more composed than carefree, more contained than spontaneous. Her expression in these images suggests watchfulness rather than joy, the face of someone constantly monitoring her own performance against unspoken standards. The curriculum at Miss Porter's and similar institutions reflects the expectations of Barbara's class and generation. French and German languages for conversing with European nobility and diplomats, English literature emphasizing poetry and moral instruction, music training focused on piano as an accomplishment for drawing room performance, and rigorous deportment lessons covering every aspect of physical presentation. Surviving school circulars and published reminiscences by alumni from this era describe hours of practice in writing formal correspondence, the proper salutation for addressing a duchess versus a countess, the exact phrasing for declining an invitation without giving offense, the prescribed interval for responding to a dinner invitation with a bread and butter note. At Miss Porter's, the daily schedule begins with mandatory chapel attendance at 7 in the morning, followed by breakfast in the communal dining room, where conversation is permitted but must remain properly modulated. Classes run from 9 until 3 with a break for lunch, and afternoon hours are devoted to supervised recreation. Walks around the grounds in prescribed areas, tennis on the school courts for those with athletic inclination, music practice in soundproofed rooms. Evenings include study hours, a formal dinner requiring full dress, and then additional time for letter writing and personal grooming before lights out at 9:30. Barbara's personal letters from this period, quoted in later unauthorized biographies, reveal a startling quality of dutifulness and constraint. They are filled with words like ought and must and should, written in impeccable penmanship that itself required hours of childhood practice, the sentences structured with formal correctness that leaves little room for spontaneous feeling or original thought. In one letter to her father, she writes, "I'm trying very hard to do everything exactly as the teachers instruct. I practice my French verbs every evening before dinner and have been told my accent is improving. I hope you are well and that business is satisfactory." The tone is that of an employee reporting to a supervisor, not a daughter writing to a parent. When she sits down to write these letters at the small desk in her dormitory room, she automatically removes her day gloves before picking up her fountain pen. When the letter is completed, blotted, folded, and sealed in its envelope, the gloves go back on before she carries it to the mail slot. This ritual of removal and replacement, performed dozens of times each week across years of schooling, becomes so habitual that she will continue it throughout her adult life. Gloves off to write checks, sign legal documents, or pen brief notes, then immediately back on once the task is completed, as if prolonged exposure of bare hands represents a kind of nakedness too vulnerable to sustain. The narrator observes that education in this context means less the transmission of ideas or the cultivation of intellectual curiosity than the inculcation of protocols. Learning how to move through rooms without disturbing their atmosphere, how to speak without saying anything challenging, how to be present while remaining essentially invisible as an individual, notable only as a representative of wealth and breeding. The curriculum trains girls to become flawlessly functioning components of a social machine, whose operations they are not encouraged to question or analyze, merely to perform with grace and precision. The girl who learns to sign her name so beautifully, with such perfect loops and measured spacing, will soon be signing marriage contracts and property transfers and divorce settlements, putting that practice signature to documents that give away far more than she understands. The same education that teaches her to write "I remain sincerely yours" with perfect penmanship never prepares her to recognize when those claiming to remain sincerely hers are actually calculating how much of her fortune they can extract before the inevitable divorce. On 14th November 1930, Barbara's 18th birthday, the ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York was transformed into a glowing spectacle of candlelight and electric illumination. Newspaper estimates place the cost of her coming-out ball at approximately $60,000, 4 times the typical expenditure for such events even in wealthy circles, and this occurs at the depth of the Great Depression, when unemployment has reached 25% and soup kitchens have become fixtures of the urban landscape. The preparations for this single evening have consumed weeks, Event planners have coordinated the delivery and arrangement of thousands of roses, lilies, and orchids flown in from greenhouses across the East Coast and from as far away as South America. The ballroom has been redecorated with silk draperies and specially commissioned lighting designed to create the effect of perpetual golden hour. A 40-piece orchestra has been hired, along with additional musicians to provide continuous music during the orchestra's breaks, ensuring that not a moment of the evening passes in silence. The champagne and other wines have been selected by a sommelier employed specifically for this event, and the catering staff numbers more than 100 people working in kitchens and serving the dinner that precedes the dancing. Society pages in the New York Times, Herald Tribune, and other papers dutifully list the guest roster. Astors, Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, foreign ambassadors, senators, and describe the entertainment imported for the occasion. Popular crooner Rudy Vallee and French singing star Maurice Chevalier, both commanding substantial fees to perform for a private audience celebrating a teenager's entry into adult society. The initial coverage is admiring in tone, marveling at the scale and elegance of the affair. Within days, however, editorial pages and gossip columns turn uneasy, questioning the morality of such extravagance when breadlines stretch for blocks just streets away from the Ritz-Carlton's marble entrance. One editorial in a progressive newspaper makes the comparison explicit. The cost of Barbara's debut could feed approximately 60,000 unemployed workers for a week, could pay rent for hundreds of families facing eviction, and could fund a soup kitchen for months. The juxtaposition of her celebration with the suffering visible on every street corner becomes impossible to ignore, and Barbara herself becomes a symbol. Unfairly, perhaps, given that she is 18 and has limited control over the event's planning or budget, of the disconnect between America's wealthy elite and the nation's economic catastrophe. Photographs taken that evening and preserved in press archives show Barbara in white satin, the traditional debutante color, with long white gloves pulled nearly to her shoulders in the style then fashionable. In one widely circulated image, she appears to press 2 fingers into the glove seam just above her wrist, as if testing whether the fabric might slip or ensuring it stays perfectly in place. The gesture is small, barely noticeable, but in frame after frame from the evening her eyes look slightly elsewhere. Not at the camera, not at her dance partners, not at the famous entertainers performing in her honor, but toward some middle distance that suggests distraction or discomfort despite the smile that protocol requires. The press coins or popularizes a nickname that will follow her for life, the poor little rich girl, a phrase that simultaneously acknowledges her material wealth and suggests that money has failed to purchase happiness or genuine human connection. The phrase itself has a history. It was used earlier in the century for other heiresses and even inspired a Mary Pickford film. But it attaches to Barbara with particular tenacity, becoming the lens through which journalists and the public will interpret every subsequent event in her life. The debut that was meant to announce her successful arrival in society, to mark her transformation from sheltered heiress into marriageable woman, to signal her readiness for the courtship rituals that would presumably lead to an appropriate match, instead marks her as a public object, a fortune with a key face, whose every subsequent action will be evaluated not for what it reveals about her as a person, but for what it demonstrates about the relationship between wealth and fulfillment in American life. She becomes, overnight and without consent, a living parable, her biography transformed into a morality tale, even as she's still living it. The narrator reflects that the debut functions as a kind of auction without an explicit bidder, a display meant to attract suitable marriage prospects, while simultaneously making Barbara a symbol of gilded excess in an age of deprivation. Within months, facing continued criticism about the ball's extravagance and her own role as lightning rod for Depression-era resentment of the wealthy, she will be sent abroad as if she, too, were an embarrassment requiring management through geographic distance, as if removing her from American soil might somehow restore the reputation that a single evening has so thoroughly complicated. In May 1931, following the controversy surrounding her debut, Barbara was dispatched to Europe by family advisors who believed that distance from American press attention and immersion in Old World culture will provide both polish and protective obscurity. On 19th May 1931, she made her curtsy at Buckingham Palace, presented at the Court of St. James alongside other debutantes in the elaborate ritual that formally introduces young women of appropriate social standing to the British monarch. Contemporary court circulars and society columns record her presence as one more American heiress, seeking the cultural legitimacy that European aristocracy still confers, part of a long tradition of wealthy New World families purchasing entree to Old World drawing rooms. The presentation itself requires meticulous preparation. Practice curtsies executed dozens of times in hotel drawing rooms under a hired instructor's supervision, ensuring the correct depth of bow and the proper way to manage the obligatory ostrich feather headdress and the train of her white court gown. The day follows a rigid schedule, dress fitting in the morning with last-minute adjustments to ensure perfect fit, hours of waiting in gloves and tiara as the queue of debutantes inches forward through palace receiving rooms, then the brief moment of actual presentation before being swept along to make room for the next girl. The court presentation represents the culmination of centuries of British social tradition, a ritual whose forms have been refined and codified across generations. Each debutante must wear a gown of precisely specified design, white or cream, with a train of specified length, modest neckline despite the evening hour. The ostrich feathers, 3 white plumes mounted on a headpiece, carry their own symbolism and history, supposedly dating back to the Black Prince in the 14th century. The curtsy itself must be deep enough to demonstrate respect but controlled enough to avoid clumsiness, executed while managing the weight of the train and the awkwardness of the headdress, a physical challenge that requires genuine athletic coordination beneath its appearance of effortless grace. Letters from chaperones quoted in later biographical reconstructions suggest that Barbara experienced the entire process as a kind of refined ordeal, feeling less like an honored guest than a display object being rotated through a series of formal rooms for inspection and approval by people whose interest in her extended only to her fortune and her acceptability as future marriage material. The other debutantes, mostly British aristocrats with a scattering of wealthy Americans and Dominion families, regard her with a mixture of envy for her fortune and condescension for her nouveau riche background. The Woolworth fortune, after all, derives from 5 and dime stores, from the pennies of working people, a source of wealth that carries a whiff of trade and commerce that true aristocrats find slightly vulgar, regardless of its scale. Walking back to the waiting car after her presentation, she reportedly flexed her gloved fingers repeatedly, complaining to her companion that she couldn't feel anything through so many layers, the formal kid gloves required for court, the rigid boning in her gown, the weight of the headdress, the remark capturing both physical discomfort and a deeper numbness about the whole performance. The gloves in particular have become constrictive, made of the finest kid leather, fitted so tightly that they create a second skin. They must be pulled on with difficulty and can only be removed with help, the tiny buttons requiring another person's assistance to unfasten. The narrator observes that Barbara's finishing school education, begun in American institutions, now extends internationally, her training in performance expanding from Fifth Avenue to Buckingham Palace gates, from American social protocols to European court customs. She is learning to navigate multiple aristocratic systems, mastering the specific gestures and forms of address that each culture requires, becoming fluent in the visual language of wealth and breeding that transcends national boundaries. Yet this very fluency, this ability to perform correctly in any setting, comes at the cost of knowing which gestures, if any, express authentic feeling rather than learned response. When every movement has been choreographed and every word has been scripted by etiquette manuals and deportment instructors, how does one recognize or express genuine emotion when it arises? The next phase of her education will come not from hired tutors or formal institutions, but from an aristocratic family already internationally famous for their strategic approach to matrimony, their calculated pursuit of wealthy spouses, their transformation of marriage itself into a kind of professional endeavor where romance serves as pleasant camouflage for fundamentally economic transactions. By early 1933, Barbara has been moving for months through fashionable European circles, the French Riviera in summer, where she rents villas in Cannes and Antibes, Biarritz in autumn, when society migrates to that Spanish border resort, Paris and London during the social season, when theaters and opera houses provide settings for elaborate entertainments. In these circles, she encounters Prince Alexis Mdivani, member of a Georgian aristocratic family that newspapers and society gossips have nicknamed the Marrying Mdivanis for their remarkable success in contracting unions with wealthy Americans. The Mdivani family's story is itself a study in strategic reinvention. Fleeing the Russian Revolution and the subsequent Soviet incorporation of Georgia, they arrived in Europe with titles but virtually no money, and set about systematically marrying into American fortunes. Alexis's brother Serge married actress Pola Negri, then Mary McCormick, heiress to international harvester. Another brother, David, married Mae Murray, a film star. Sister Rusadana married Jose Maria Sert, a Spanish painter, then later William Carroll Nichols, tobacco heir. The pattern is unmistakable. Each Mdivani sibling identifies a wealthy spouse, marries them, extracts substantial funds during and after the marriage, and moves on. Society observers, at once admiring and appalled, treat the family as a kind of matrimonial enterprise, their titles functioning as the primary asset in a business model based on converting aristocratic prestige into American cash. Contemporary biographers piecing together events from multiple sources describe how Alexis's sister, Princess Isabel Russi Mdivani Sert, orchestrates a compromising situation during a house party in San Sebastian, Spain. Barbara and Alexis are discovered together in a guest cottage on the estate grounds in circumstances that, while perhaps innocent, can be interpreted as scandalous. Faced with the possibility of ruinous headlines suggesting sexual impropriety at a time when a wealthy young woman's reputation constitutes her primary social asset, Barbara flees immediately to Paris. Contemporary accounts and later memoirs describe Russi's calculated pressure. Without a wedding to legitimize the situation retroactively, the story will reach gossip columns. Damage will be irreparable. Barbara's marriage prospects within respectable society will evaporate. The threat is credible because the Mdivanis have extensive press contacts cultivated precisely for leveraging such situations, and because Barbara has already experienced how quickly newspapers can turn her private life into public entertainment after the debut ball controversy. On 22 June 1933, in a Russian Orthodox ceremony in Paris, Barbara Hutton married Prince Alexis Mdivani. Trust documents and contemporary financial reporting show that her father, Franklin Hutton, provides a dowry of $1 million immediately, an enormous sum in Depression-era currency, and that within 2 years additional, millions flow from Barbara's accounts to purchase a house in Paris, polo ponies for Alexis, who fancies himself a sportsman, expensive automobiles including multiple Rolls-Royces, and elaborate men's jewelry that the prince favors, particularly jeweled cigarette cases and cufflinks that become his signature affectation. The spending pattern established in this first marriage, fortune transferred rapidly from heiress to husband with little accountability or restraint, no prenuptial agreements to protect capital, no trust structures to limit access, will repeat with variations through subsequent unions. Each husband will find his own preferred method of extracting wealth, some through direct gifts, others through allowances and expense accounts, still others through settlements negotiated at divorce. Wedding photographs from the Paris ceremony, reproduced in international newspapers and preserved in photographic archives, show a curious asymmetry that later observers note as symbolically revealing. Barbara's hands are encased in immaculate white gloves, formal and proper, her arms held in the precise position that years of training have made automatic, while Alexis's hands are conspicuously bare, already reaching toward her, already grasping, his fingers adorned with the expensive rings she has purchased for him. The contrast between her covered restraint and his naked acquisition visible in every frame. The narrator reflects that the etiquette lessons Barbara absorbed at Miss Porter's The deportment training and instruction in proper social form have not prepared her for blackmail disguised as romance, for calculated scandal deployed as a marriage tactic. She has been taught to fear impropriety, to value reputation above almost all else, to understand that a woman's standing in society depends on maintaining absolute respectability. These very lessons make her vulnerable to manipulation by those willing to threaten the reputation she has been trained to protect at any cost. By May 1935, barely 2 years after the Mdivani wedding, that marriage had deteriorated into public acrimony punctuated by fights over money and Alexis's barely concealed affairs with other women. Barbara finds herself seeking escape through another aristocratic union, though in this case the courtship involves less manipulation and more mutual desperation, both parties looking for rescue from situations they find untenable. That month she wed Count Kurt von Haugwitz-Hardenberg Reventlow in a ceremony in London. The Count is Danish, his title ancient and legitimate in ways that the Georgian Mdivani claims were not, offering what her social circle considers real European nobility rather than dubious princelings whose credentials could not withstand serious genealogical scrutiny. Legal documents filed in various European jurisdictions and court records that later become part of divorce proceedings tell a darker story than the wedding announcements suggest. Reventlow proves controlling and physically violent, his aristocratic background providing him with a sense of absolute authority over his wife that he enforces through intimidation and assault. One beating severe enough to require medical attention sends Barbara to hospital with visible bruises and a possible concussion. Reventlow is briefly arrested, though family influence and strategic financial pressure prevent the incident from becoming a major scandal or resulting in serious legal consequences. The violence follows a pattern common in abusive relationships. Initial charm and attentiveness, followed by increasing control over Barbara's movements and social contacts, then escalating verbal aggression, and finally physical assault that Reventlow invariably justifies as provoked by Barbara's behavior or necessary to correct her failures as a wife. He monitors her spending despite having no independent income of his own, questions her about every social interaction, and gradually isolates her from friends and family who might provide support or witness the abuse. Under his influence and apparently seeking tax advantages on her American source income, though one suspects the decision serves his interests more than hers, Barbara takes the extraordinary step of renouncing her United States citizenship in December 1937, exchanging her American passport for Danish nationality. The decision will later complicate her legal and financial affairs significantly, making it more difficult to manage her American trust funds and properties, and will also provoke criticism in American press that accuses her of abandoning her country to avoid taxation. A charge that carries particular weight during the Depression, when public resentment of wealthy tax avoiders runs high. Their son, Lance Reventlow, is born in February 1936, giving Barbara the motherhood she has hoped might provide purpose and genuine emotional connection in a life increasingly characterized by hollow performances and transactional relationships. Photographs from this period show her holding the infant with visible care, her gloves removed for once, her hands bare against the baby's delicate skin, as if she fears her touch through leather might somehow harm him or create distance from the one person in her life who has not sought her for her fortune. The child will grow up largely separated from his mother. Reventlow will fight aggressively for custody during divorce proceedings, using his superior legal position as a European nobleman and Barbara's documented prescription drug use as ammunition, and will become a racing driver and automotive constructor, designing the Scarab sports car that briefly competes in Formula One. But he died in July 1972, at age 36, when his small plane crashed in the Colorado mountains during a land scouting trip, adding another abrupt and terrible loss to a life already marked by them. The narrator observes that in giving up her passport, her citizenship, her national identity for the sake of a marriage that is already violent and that will end in divorce within a few years, Barbara demonstrates how completely marriage in her world can function as a form of total transformation. Identity itself becomes negotiable, subject to the strategic requirements of international tax law and the demands of husbands who wield legal and physical power over wives whose fortunes they control while contributing nothing of their own. The architecture of marriage, as practiced in elite circles, reveals itself as something more totalizing than romantic partnership, a legal and financial structure that can erase prior selves, relocate identities across borders, transform American heiresses into European countesses whose nationality follows their husband's convenience rather than their own preferences. To escape the violence and scandal of the Reventlow marriage, Barbara will eventually turn toward Hollywood and toward a husband who represents something genuinely unusual in her marital history, a man with his own fame and fortune, who neither needs nor particularly wants access to her money, whose interest in her appears to be motivated by attraction rather than by economic calculation. For a brief period, she will experience something approximating an equitable relationship, though even this cannot undo decades of training in distrust or reverse the patterns of dependence that have already taken root. During the early 1940s, with World War II reshaping European geography and American society, Barbara spends increasing time in California, where she moves in film industry circles and meets actor Cary Grant at a social event in Los Angeles. They marry on 8th July 1942 in a ceremony that generates enormous press attention and produces the headline that will define their union in public memory, Cash and Carry, a play on words that reduces their relationship to the meeting of her fortune and his fame while erasing any possibility of genuine feeling between them. Grant at this point is at the height of his Hollywood career, having starred in a series of successful films throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s. He is handsome, charming, professionally accomplished, and financially secure through his own work, characteristics that make him genuinely unusual among Barbara's romantic interests, most of whom have brought little to relationships except titles and demands for money. Contemporary observers note that Grant actually attempts to discourage Barbara from extravagant gift-giving, resists her efforts to subsidize his lifestyle, and maintains his own career and income throughout their marriage, behavior so contrary to her previous experiences that they seem to confuse and perhaps even alarm her. At the time of their marriage, Barbara owns Winfield House in Regent's Park, London, a substantial neo-Georgian mansion built for her in 1936 on the site of St. Dunstan's Villa, which had been damaged by fire. The house, designed by architect Leonard Rome Guthrie, sits on 12 acres and boasts the second-largest private garden in London, after Buckingham Palace itself. Wartime circumstances reshaped the property's use. Contemporary photographs and Royal Air Force records show the mansion commandeered for military purposes during the war years, with RAF officers occupying rooms where Barbara had entertained European aristocrats and Hollywood celebrities, while Barbara makes her own contribution to the war effort by donating her ocean-going yacht to the Royal Navy for patrol duty and participating in war bond drives where her celebrity status helps sell government securities. Grant stands out among Barbara's 7 eventual husbands as genuinely anomalous. Biographical accounts and later interviews with people close to both parties emphasize that he neither sought nor received any substantial financial settlement from her during their marriage or in their divorce proceedings when they separated in 1945. Contemporary observers and later chroniclers suggest that he genuinely cared for her welfare, was concerned about her increasing dependence on prescription drugs and alcohol, and attempted to provide emotional support without financial exploitation, a pattern so contrary to her other marriages that it seems to have confused and perhaps frightened her, as if she didn't trust kindness that came without a price tag clearly visible. The marriage's dissolution in 1945 appears to be driven more by incompatibility and the pressures of their very different careers than by the financial exploitation and abuse that characterized her other unions. Grant wants a partner who can accompany him to Hollywood events and studio functions, who can maintain the relatively normal domestic life he craves as respite from his public performances. Barbara wants protection from the world and validation that her wealth alone cannot provide, but she also cannot escape the patterns of dependency and distrust that decades of exploitation have instilled. The fundamental mismatch between his desire for normalcy and her need for constant dramatic reassurance makes the marriage ultimately unsustainable, despite the absence of the financial predation that complicates her other relationships. Formal photographic portraits from this period show subtle shifts in Barbara's presentation. Her gloves in these images are softer than in earlier formal pictures, ruched satin rather than rigid kid leather, suggesting evening elegance rather than defensive armor. Yet her posture remains carefully controlled, her shoulders held at the precise angle that years of deportment training have made automatic, her expression pleasant but guarded, as if she is waiting for the photographer to finish so the performance can end and she can retreat to privacy. Even in photographs with Grant, where they pose as an affectionate couple, a certain distance remains visible in her eyes, a withholding that suggests she cannot fully believe in the kindness he offers. The narrator reflects that for a brief moment in the early 1940s, the refinement and grace that Barbara has been trained to perform seemed to align with genuine affection rather than operating as mere social defense. Yet even this relatively healthy relationship cannot undo decades of earlier conditioning that have taught her to equate love with lavish gift-giving, marriage with financial transaction, and genuine interest with economic exploitation. The skills that were supposed to prepare her for successful marriage, deportment and etiquette, and careful self-presentation have instead prepared her primarily for relationships with men who value those skills as indicators of the fortune they conceal rather than as expressions of the person performing them. By the late 1930s and continuing into the immediate post-war period of 1937 through 1946, Winfield House becomes the architectural embodiment of Barbara's position in international society, a vast red brick Georgian revival mansion with interiors designed by French decorators, rooms hung with old master paintings inherited from the Woolworth Art Collection, and extensive formal gardens that rival those of royal estates. Contemporary architectural photographs and estate plans preserved in British archives document the property's scale. Reception rooms capable of entertaining hundreds of guests, private apartments designed for extended residence, service wings housing the substantial staff required to maintain such an establishment, conservatories for growing the flowers that fill the public rooms, and stables that once housed horses but now garage the automobiles that have replaced them. The gardens themselves are masterworks of landscape architecture, designed by formal landscape designers to create a series of distinct outdoor rooms connected by gravel paths and hedges. There are rose gardens with hundreds of varieties arranged by color, a kitchen garden producing vegetables and herbs for the house's tables, ornamental ponds with imported water lilies, and lawns maintained with the obsessive care that English gardens require. Grass cut to precise height and edges trimmed with mathematical exactness. The gardens require a staff of dedicated gardeners working year-round, their labor invisible except in the carefully maintained results that provide settings for garden parties and afternoon teas. Yet Barbara spends relatively little time actually living at Winfield House, despite the enormous expense of building and maintaining it. The rhythms of her life scatter her across California, where she maintains a presence near the film industry and her husband Cary Grant, various European hotels and rented villas where she retreats for privacy, and eventually medical clinics where she receives treatment for prescription drug dependency, alcoholism, and what contemporary doctors diagnose as nervous exhaustion, their vague terminology concealing conditions they don't fully understand or know how to treat effectively. The wartime commandeering of Winfield House by the Royal Air Force continues into the post-war period, and in 1946, after her divorce from Grant, Barbara makes the decision to donate the entire property to the United States government for use as the official residence of the American ambassador to the United Kingdom, a function it continues to serve decades later. The donation is structured carefully through legal counsel to maximize tax advantages while genuinely serving a diplomatic purpose, the house's scale and location making it ideal for the entertaining and hosting that ambassadorial duties require. In a quiet ceremonial photograph taken when the property transfer is formalized, Barbara appears in a dark dress with pale gloves, her fingers loosely interlaced rather than gripping anything. her expression composed but distant, the legal documents transferring title, and the press coverage of the donation emphasize the property's value. Estimated at over $1 million in 1946 currency, equivalent to many millions in current dollars, and the generosity of the gesture, framing Barbara as a patriotic American contributing to her country's diplomatic infrastructure despite her earlier renunciation of citizenship. What remains less discussed in the official accounts is the relief the donation may have represented, the burden of another vast property eliminated, the responsibility of maintenance and staffing transferred to government resources backed by taxpayer funding, the symbolic weight of yet another grand house lifted from shoulders already bearing more than they can sustain. The donation allows Barbara to transform what has become a liability, an expensive property she rarely occupies, requiring constant upkeep and security, into a public-spirited gesture that generates positive press attention while solving a practical problem. The narrator observes a paradox that characterizes much of Barbara's relationship with property and possession. The houses and estates that might have provided stability and roots instead become emblems of isolation. Too large to feel like homes, too expensive to maintain without constant anxiety, too empty of genuine human connection to offer the comfort their luxury promises. Winfield House, which survives her and continues its diplomatic function into the present day, proves most meaningful precisely when she relinquishes ownership, when it transitions from private showcase to public service, when she lets it go and stops trying to make it function as the refuge she needs. In Tangier, Morocco, during the late 1940s and 1950s, Barbara will make one more attempt to construct a physical refuge, a house that might somehow protect her from the escalating chaos of her personal life. She will discover, as she has discovered before, that walls, no matter how thick, no matter how beautifully decorated, no matter how strategically located in an international zone beyond the reach of American and European press, cannot keep misfortune outside when the real dangers travel inside one's own luggage, hidden among the designer gowns and prescription bottles. In the late 1940s, Barbara relocated to Tangier, Morocco, then an international zone governed by multiple European powers and offering wealthy expatriates a combination of exotic atmosphere, extremely favorable tax treatment, and distance from the social conventions and constant press scrutiny that characterize life in Europe and America. The city has become a haven for various forms of expatriation, political exiles, tax refugees, artists and writers seeking inspiration and freedom, homosexuals escaping legal persecution, and wealthy eccentrics who find the city's cosmopolitan chaos more welcoming than the rigid hierarchies they've left behind. There, she acquires a sprawling house in the Kasbah, the old fortified quarter overlooking the port, by purchasing and connecting several traditional Moroccan dwellings to create a single eccentric residence. The process of combining these houses requires substantial renovation. Walls removed to create passageways, new doorways cut through ancient masonry, modern plumbing, and electrical systems installed in buildings that predate such conveniences by centuries. A 1961 feature in House and Garden magazine describes the resulting property as a labyrinthine complex of courtyards, terraces, and interconnected rooms decorated with a mixture of European antiques from her previous houses and North African textiles and furniture purchased in local souks, the whole creating an atmospheric hybrid that belongs fully to neither culture. The house itself becomes a kind of physical metaphor for Barbara's life at this point, a collection of disparate elements awkwardly joined together, beautiful in parts but lacking overall coherence, offering multiple spaces for retreat and hiding, but no center that might constitute an actual home. She fills rooms with valuable objects but rarely uses the formal spaces, preferring to occupy a small suite where she can be attended by staff without navigating the full maze of the property. In Zurich, in the spring of 1948, Barbara marries her fourth husband, Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Russian émigré aristocrat who has gained international fame as a racing driver, notably piloting the first Ferrari to compete in Grand Prix racing and establishing himself as a figure in the glamorous world of post-war European motorsport. Trubetskoy brings genuine accomplishment and international celebrity to the marriage, his fame in sporting circles rivaling her own notoriety in social ones, but he brings very little money. His aristocratic family lost everything in the Russian Revolution, and racing, while prestigious, provides minimal income for all but the most successful drivers. Financial records from this period and later biographical accounts document substantial expenditures from Barbara's accounts to maintain multiple European properties, pay for extensive household staff across several countries, and support Trubetskoy's expensive participation in international motor racing, which requires purchasing cars, hiring mechanics, paying entry fees, and funding travel to races across Europe. Meanwhile, Barbara's own physical and mental health deteriorates into deepening dependency on prescription sedatives, stimulants, and alcohol, combined with increasingly extreme dieting that reduces her weight to dangerous levels and requires periodic hospitalization to address malnutrition and related complications. When Trubetskoy files for divorce in the early 1950s, newspapers frame the story as yet another chapter in the ongoing cautionary tale of the poor little rich girl, the heiress who cannot find happiness despite unlimited resources. One widely reported suicide attempt during this period. Barbara takes an overdose of sleeping pills but is discovered and revived by household staff who break down her locked bedroom door. Becomes international news, her private despair transformed into public spectacle, and magazine cover stories about the emptiness of wealth. The photographs of her being loaded into an ambulance reproduced in newspapers from New York to Sydney. Press photographs from Tangier during these years show a striking visual shift from her earlier formal portraits. Barbara leans against a carved Moorish column, wearing a flowing caftan rather than the structured European clothing she previously favored, her hair loose rather than carefully styled, and most significantly, her hands are bare and gripping the stone, the formal gloves that once seemed permanently attached to her person now absent. The gesture suggests either liberation from earlier constraints or the abandonment of the protections that social form once provided, or perhaps both simultaneously, the dissolution of rigid performance resulting in both freedom and vulnerability, the removal of armor making her more authentically visible, but also more exposed to harm. The narrator reflects that, even in self-imposed exile in Morocco, even in a house designed as a refuge from European and American social expectations, Barbara's life continues to function as serialized entertainment for a public fascinated by watching great wealth fail to produce contentment. Each marriage becomes another episode in a long-running narrative whose moral, that money cannot buy happiness, is so familiar as to be cliché, yet whose specific details remain compelling precisely because they involve quantities of money that make theoretical unhappiness concrete and documentable in trust fund drawdowns, divorce settlements, and the itemized bills from sanatoriums and clinics. On 30th of December 1953, in a ceremony that generates immediate international press attention and considerable gossip column speculation about her judgment, Barbara Hutton marries her fifth husband, Porfirio Rubirosa, a Dominican diplomat and internationally celebrated playboy whose romantic history includes marriages to two of the world's richest women, Doris Duke, the tobacco heiress, and Danielle Darrieux, the French actress, and affairs with countless others. Rubirosa is famous not for any particular accomplishment, but for being famous, for embodying a particular ideal of sophisticated masculine sexuality, for the expensive gifts he extracts from wealthy women, and for his ability to move through international society as if born to it despite his relatively modest background. The union lasted precisely 53 days before its dissolution in February 1954, making it among the shortest marriages on record for a major fortune heiress. Society coverage during and immediately after the marriage dwells on the extravagant gifts Barbara showers on Rubirosa. Sports cars including multiple Ferraris, polo ponies and the stabling and staff required to maintain them, a converted B-25 bomber aircraft that he uses for personal travel, jewelry including a famous emerald ring, and substantial cash settlements both during the marriage and as part of the divorce agreement that significantly exceed anything she received in return, Gossip columns report with barely concealed glee that Rubirosa maintains an active and barely concealed affair with actress Zsa Zsa Gabor throughout his marriage to Barbara, making little effort at discretion, sometimes attending parties with Gabor while still legally married to Barbara. The humiliation is public and deliberate, Rubirosa apparently viewing the marriage primarily as a business transaction requiring minimal performance of affection once the gifts have been secured. When Barbara finally initiates divorce proceedings, he negotiates a settlement that provides him with ongoing income in exchange for agreeing not to contest the divorce or speak publicly about their brief marriage. In April 1955, attempting to find stability through a marriage based on long friendship rather than romantic passion, Barbara wed Baron Gottfried von Gramm, a former German tennis star who had reached 3 consecutive Wimbledon finals in the 1930s and whom she has known for years through mutual friends in international sporting and social circles. Von Gramm is gentler and more considerate than most of her previous husbands, their relationship characterized more by companionship than by intensity. And this 6th marriage proves more stable and lasts until their divorce in 1959. Making it one of her longer unions. Then, in 1964, in Tangier, Barbara marries her 7th and final husband, Pierre Raymond Doan, a Vietnamese-born chemist whose aristocratic title, Doan Vinh Na Champasak, Prince of Laos, has been purchased from a deposed royal family, making it technically genuine in the sense that the title exists and has been legally transferred, but practically meaningless since the kingdom it supposedly represents no longer exists and confers no actual authority or status. Beyond what credulous observers might grant it, contemporary magazine profiles and later biographical summaries note the pattern with clinical precision. Among Barbara's 7 husbands are 2 princes, one Georgian, one Laotian, a Danish count, a German baron, an American film star, a Dominican diplomat playboy, and a Southeast Asian chemist. Most spend her money lavishly during the marriages and negotiate generous financial settlements upon divorce. The accumulated cost of these marriages, measured in dowries, gifts, property purchases, ongoing allowances, and divorce settlements, totals tens of millions of dollars. A substantial portion of the Woolworth inheritance spent on relationships that provide neither lasting happiness nor even temporary financial security. Auction catalogs from Christie's and other major houses in the decades following her death list extraordinary jewels once in her collection. Historic pieces with documented provenance linking them to Marie Antoinette, Empress Eugenie, and various European royal houses, sold after her death or by subsequent owners, their detailed descriptions carefully noting their passage through the Hutton collection as a mark of value and authenticity that increases the prices bidders are willing to pay for objects that once adorned her neck and wrists. The narrator observes that marriage, for Barbara, evolves from a search for love and protection into something closer to a series of expensive experiments in outsourcing security and companionship. Each new husband represents a different hypothesis about what kind of man might provide the stability and genuine affection she seeks. A European prince who might value her fortune enough to stay, an aristocrat whose title might intimidate other fortune hunters, a film star whose own fame might make her wealth less central to the relationship, a diplomat whose sophistication might match her experience, a baron whose long friendship might prove more durable than romantic passion, a distant prince whose marginal status might make him grateful rather than exploitative. By the late 1960s, after decades of lavish spending on 7 marriages, multiple properties acquired and sold across 3 continents, extensive staff salaries often supporting households she barely occupies, jewelry purchases frequently followed by resales at substantial loss when cash is needed for other expenses, gifts to husbands and their families totaling millions, legal fees for divorce proceedings that employ expensive international lawyers, medical treatment in exclusive clinics in Switzerland and America, and the simple daily cost of maintaining the lifestyle expected of a Woolworth heiress, even as the fortune supporting that lifestyle steadily erodes. Financial analyses suggest that Barbara's inheritance has diminished dramatically, contemporary estimates placed her inheritance between $40 million and $70 million when she reached majority in the 1930s, equivalent to several $100 million in current purchasing power. But by the 1960s, trust fund statements and financial advisor reports indicate the capital has shrunk toward the edge of insolvency, with remaining assets increasingly encumbered by debt and legal claims. The erosion has been gradual but relentless, each divorce removing millions, each house purchase reducing liquid capital, each year's living expenses consuming income that no longer gets replaced through investment growth. Then, in July 1972, tragedy struck with the devastating force that has punctuated her life since her mother's death in 1917. Her only child, Lance Raventlow, dies at age 36 when the small Cessna aircraft he is piloting crashes in the Rocky Mountains near Aspen, Colorado, during a trip to scout land for a potential property purchase. The crash occurs in deteriorating weather conditions. The small plane apparently caught in downdrafts or wind shear that overwhelms the pilot's ability to maintain control, and Lance dies on impact along with his passenger. Newspaper obituaries describe him as a racing driver and automotive constructor who designed the Scarab sports car, a beautiful American-built sports racer that briefly competed against European manufacturers in Formula One racing before being withdrawn when it proved uncompetitive against the superior technology of Ferrari and Maserati. But for Barbara, the loss represents something beyond these public accomplishments. The death of her last direct family connection, the end of any possibility of grandchildren who might have provided continuity and purpose, another sudden and inexplicable removal of someone central to her emotional life, the repetition of the pattern that began with her mother's death and has continued through decades of loss and abandonment. Biographical accounts written after Barbara's death link Lance's death to a marked acceleration in her withdrawal from any remaining social engagement and to increased reliance on prescription medications, barbiturates for sleep, tranquilizers for anxiety, painkillers for various physical ailments, stimulants to counteract the sedative effects of the other drugs, creating a pharmaceutical regime that doctors have been prescribing for decades to manage her chronic emotional and physical distress, but that now constitutes its own medical crisis, the medications interacting unpredictably and contributing to the decline they are meant to alleviate. In one frequently reproduced photograph from the early 1970s, Barbara attends some unspecified public event wearing a dramatic tiara and an enormous emerald necklace of historic significance, jewels whose combined value would comfortably support a family for years or fund substantial charitable works. Yet her face appears drawn and aged beyond her chronological years, her body visibly frail beneath the elaborate jewelry, flesh pulled tight over bones, her gloved hands hanging loosely at her sides rather than clutching anything or posed in any particular gesture, the fingers curved slightly as if they have forgotten what they are supposed to hold or how they are supposed to present themselves. The image circulates in magazines with captions that emphasize the contrast between material wealth still evident in the jewels and visible loneliness and decline evident in her appearance, using her as yet another illustration of the familiar morale about money's limits, the inability of wealth to purchase health or happiness or protection from mortality and loss. The narrator reflects that the dynasty Frank Woolworth imagined when he built his five and dime empire and constructed adjoining mansions for his descendants. A vision of family continuity, of wealth passed down through generations of successful Woolworths, of grandchildren and great-grandchildren enjoying the security his ambition had created, narrows in Barbara's life. To a solitary figure in evening gloves and borrowed jewels, some pieces now technically owned by creditors, though she retains possession, a woman who has outlived her mother, her only child, most of her 7 husbands, many of her childhood contemporaries, and the fortune itself, standing alone in spaces too large and too empty to feel like anything except the architecture of loss made visible in marble and gilt. In May 1979, Barbara Woolworth Hutton died at age 66 in her penthouse suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills, California, after several years of increasingly frail health and near-total seclusion from the social world she once inhabited. Press coverage of her death emphasizes a detail that has become central to her legend, and that crystallizes the moral tale her life has been made to represent. She dies nearly penniless, with various accounts citing a bank balance of approximately $3,500, though the exact figure remains contested, and some financial analysts suggest slightly higher amounts when various remaining assets are included, perhaps reaching $50,000 to $100,000, still a staggering reduction from the fortune she inherited. The contrast between this sum and the fortune she received 5 decades earlier, tens of millions of dollars that would be worth several hundred million in current purchasing power, becomes the final illustration in the morality tale that journalists and biographers have been constructing from her life, the ultimate proof that money cannot buy happiness or security, or even preserve itself across a lifetime of poor decisions and exploitation by others. Hotel staff members interviewed after her death and contemporary newspaper reporting describe her final years as lived in drastically reduced circumstances compared to her earlier life of vast estates and international travel. She occupies a few rooms in a hotel suite rather than the mansions she once maintained across multiple continents, employs a small staff of a few attendants where she once had households of dozens, and follows a daily routine focused largely on medication schedules, occasional visits from the few remaining associates and paid companions who constitute her entire social circle, and watching television, which provides a connection to the wider world she has otherwise withdrawn from almost completely. The endless parade of properties that once defined her geographic and social identity, the Manhattan townhouse where she spent her childhood, Winfield House in London with its 12 acres of gardens, the Tangier Casbah compound with its labyrinthine rooms and courtyards, various California estates in Beverly Hills and Palm Beach, Paris apartments overlooking fashionable arrondissements, hotel suites in European capitals, has contracted to rented space with no land beneath it, no gardens to walk through, no architecture of permanence or ownership, only temporary occupancy paid for by the month from dwindling resources that will not outlast her by many years. When her estate is inventoried after death, and when jewelry with her provenance later appears in Christie's and Sotheby's auction houses, the catalog descriptions demonstrate the meticulous care that auction houses devoted to objects of significant value and historical interest. Precise carat weights of gemstones, detailed histories tracing pieces through previous royal and aristocratic owners, high-resolution photographs showing Barbara wearing particular pieces at documented social events, expert authentication of attributions and settings, estimates of value that reflect both the intrinsic worth of materials and the premium that provenance from a famous collection commands. The gloves she adjusted so carefully throughout her life, pulling them higher on her arms before photographers, smoothing them against her skin when nervous, removing and replacing them countless times in the endless rituals of formal social life, do not appear as individual items in these estate inventories or later auctions. Unlike jewelry or furniture or artwork, gloves are too fragile and too common to preserve, their material value negligible even when made from the finest kid leather or most delicate lace. They survive primarily as elements in photographs, white against skin, framing hands as they wave to cameras, or clutch dance cards, or sign marriage certificates, or simply rest in laps during the long hours of posing for society photographers who documented every public appearance. The narrator reflects that the record that remains after Barbara's death is overwhelmingly transactional. Trust fund balances charting the decline of capital, marriage settlements documenting the transfer of millions to former husbands, property sales recording the liquidation of assets to fund ongoing expenses, divorce decrees marking the legal end of relationships that ended emotionally years earlier, auction results listing the prices her jewelry commanded from collectors who valued the objects but had no interest in the woman who wore them, and thousands upon thousands of photographs documenting her appearance at events whose emotional reality can only be guessed at from facial expressions frozen by flashbulbs and the body language visible in carefully posed arrangements. The emotional ledger, what she actually felt during the marriages and divorces, what comfort or distress the houses and jewels actually provided beyond their symbolic functions, what genuine relationships existed beneath the documented financial transactions, whether any of the 7 husbands loved her for even a moment beyond the calculation of what her fortune might provide them, proves far harder to read with any confidence. Such things, if they were preserved at all, exist in fragments of reported conversation whose accuracy cannot be verified, in the testimony of faces in photographs, whose expressions must be interpreted across decades of historical and cultural distance, in the speculation of biographers who construct narratives from insufficient evidence and their own assumptions about what wealth does to personality and relationship. In a quiet corner of a museum exhibition decades after Barbara Hutton's death, a small crowd of visitors pauses before a large black and white photograph displayed under carefully calibrated conservation lighting designed to prevent fading while making the image visible. The photograph shows Barbara Hutton in formal evening dress from approximately the mid-1930s, seated in an ornate chair with her hands folded in her lap, long pale gloves extending nearly to her elbows in the style fashionable during that decade, an elaborate necklace at her throat catching light in a way that suggests substantial gemstones, though the black and white photography renders them as highlights and shadows rather than revealing their actual colors. The exhibition label mounted on the wall beside the photograph provides the essential biographical data in clean contemporary sans serif typography. Barbara Woolworth Hutton, 1912 to 1979. Woolworth, 5 and dime, heiress. 7 marriages to princes, counts, barons, and celebrities. Estimated fortune at age 21, $70 million, equivalent to approximately $800 million today. Estate value at death, approximately $3,500. Photograph, circa 1935. Photographer unknown. The label's clinical precision transforms a life into statistics, reducing decades of experience to a few numbers that emphasize the shocking dissipation of wealth. Nearby, in a separate climate-controlled vitrine made of UV filtering glass, rests a jeweled object, a magnificent brooch or perhaps a bracelet. The exhibition notes are not entirely clear, whose descriptive card traces its documented provenance through several European royal collections during the 18th and 19th centuries, before noting its passage through the Hutton collection in the 1950s and its subsequent sale at Christie's in the 1980s, a decade after Barbara's death. The card includes a small reproduction of a photograph showing Barbara wearing the piece at a documented social event. The image so reduced in scale that individual features blur into grain and shadow, but the outline of long gloves against bare arms remains clearly visible, the gloves functioning as a kind of visual signature that identifies her even when facial features cannot be distinguished. No actual gloves appear anywhere in the exhibition's carefully curated display cases. The physical objects, the dozens or hundreds of pairs of kid leather, satin, silk, and lace gloves that Barbara must have owned and worn across 6 decades of constantly photographed public life, from her mother's funeral when she was 4 through her final public appearances in the early 1970s, have vanished or been dispersed or simply deteriorated in storage, too fragile to survive and too common to merit the kind of archival preservation devoted to more valuable or historically significant objects. The gloves remain present only in images, thin barriers between skin and world, white against white in the photographs, visible primarily as texture and outline, and the subtle play of light on fabric, occasionally bearing the small wrinkles and tensions that reveal the living hand inside, but more often appearing smooth and perfect, the material subordinated to the overall composition and meaning of the photograph. In the large formal photograph that serves as the exhibition's centerpiece, if one examines Barbara's folded hands with close attention, a slight but unmistakable tension appears in the fingers. Not dramatic, not immediately obvious to casual observers, but present nonetheless for those who look carefully. The white glove fingers press slightly into each other as if testing for sensation through the fabric that separates skin from skin, or perhaps steadying themselves against the chair arms for the minutes of absolute motionlessness that formal photography of that era required, or simply bracing against some interior discomfort or anxiety that cannot be named or acknowledged in the context of a formal portrait meant to project elegance and social confidence. The gesture visible in this photograph mirrors, across decades and despite completely different contexts, that earlier image from her 1930 debut at the Ritz-Carlton. The 18-year-old Barbara clutching her dance card with visible tension, while the caption introduced the poor little rich girl to a reading public that would follow her story with fascination tinged by Schadenfreude for the next 50 years. The similarity suggests that the tension, the bracing, the subtle physical manifestation of interior constraint never fully resolved itself, that the performance of ease and elegance required constant effort throughout her life, regardless of how much practice she accumulated. But now, viewed from the distance of decades after her death, and with the knowledge of everything that followed, the 7 marriages and 7 divorces, the steady dissipation of the enormous fortune through gifts and settlements and poor investments, and the simple daily cost of maintaining the lifestyle expected of someone in her position, the loss of her only child in a plane crash, the final years alone in a hotel suite, the death leaving almost nothing behind except photographs and auction records. The small tension visible in those gloved fingers carries the accumulated weight of an entire life spent performing elegance and discovering that such performance protected nothing, that the skills so carefully taught provided no genuine defense against exploitation or loss or loneliness.